All right, well, welcome Reimagine Technical Working Group, November 10th, meeting number 12. Your safety moment for today is the following. It's darker earlier now, and for those of you who are waiting at one of our bus stops and it's dark, one of the things you can do to let the bus operator know you want to get on board is to hold up your phone, because that's a way that they can see something that's brighter. Also helps if you're wearing something brighter, but go ahead and do that. Don't jump out in the street and wave your arms. That's not nearly as safe. It's not safe at all. Stay on the sidewalk in the shelter, show them your phone, and they'll pull right over and pick you up, because you're all using our buses, aren't you? Yes. You need to be out there riding the system. So with that, I will turn it over to Holly, and thank you in advance for collaborating with us on this noble endeavor.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. I am glad that the safety moment stayed safe. We almost turned into like an unsafety moment there with the bus waving. So we have as always, a packed agenda, and I think some really interesting stuff to talk about. I'm going to give you a very high level overview on the system optimization plan update. We've met with a number of you on the technical working group in the last couple of weeks to start that dialogue at that service sector level for the SOP. And we're getting ready to set the second round of meetings for that as well. Thank you for your participation in those. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about the mobility plan for the future. We're going to talk about those mobility as a service, mobility on demand recommendations, first and last mile recommendations. We have an update for you on the initial zero emission fleet analysis that's been done, as well as some information on the facilities and some good stuff around the start of the dialogue around how we're going to shore up partnerships and workforce recommendations. So lots of good stuff to cover. Our intent during this meeting is we have very short stints of information, and then we're going to open it up to conversation, answer questions, have dialogue around what the preliminary recommendations that we're presenting to you. So it's going to be hopefully very conversational, and we're excited to hear back from you on our initial recommendations and our findings. So Katie, I think there's a table on the next slide, and I think we can even skip that one because we reviewed that at our last meeting. But I did want to give just some overview for those of you that were not able to participate in the service sector meetings that we held a couple of weeks ago. You know, you'll recall that our plan is to hold 3 of these for each sector. We had the first of these 3, and we reviewed information on the flex rides, mobility on demand, and asked the groups about what their local needs were, because that's one of the things that we've been hearing from you since the start really of Reimagine, is that the local agencies have a lot of on the ground information about the local need that they'd like to make sure that RTD is aware of as they're making service planning changes. So that was the start of the conversation, certainly not the end, but the first of 3 that we have meetings that we have planned for each of the service sectors. Some of the feedback that we got, I think we've heard this before, there was really strong support for better defining the partnership and IGA process with RTD. I think we've all learned through this process that RTD has a tremendous number of partnerships and pilot projects underway. It seems at all times there's a lot going on, but the process for getting to use that partnership and developing an IGA with RTD is not very well defined. So that was one of the one piece of feedback that we received a couple of times. There was also the suggestion to make sure that as we're building services back up, that we're really marketing the service and trying to attract as many people as we can to the service. Each of the groups had different areas of focus for us, whether it was a job center where people are starting to come back to work and trying to make sure that we're providing service to them, or senior living centers that might need service. So everybody had their own unique focus. So that was really where we got into those local details, and that was really helpful feedback. Wanting to make sure that RTD understands and considering the growth in areas. So while a lot of these recommendations are very near term, making sure that we always have an eye to the future. And then talking to make sure that we're coordinating with CDOT on their regional services and interregional services so that we're all coordinated and providing the best comprehensive network of services that we can. So the second round of these meetings, we're just getting finalized on the dates for those. I had hoped it would be the first week of December. We're actually targeting the second week of December, and it's about like the 13th to the 16th of December, I want to say, are the dates we're looking at. I'm going to get those on your calendars just as soon as I can shore those up. One thing, and Julie, help me out here. One thing that I have had some feedback, and I wanted to make sure that we were consistent on our approach with this. These meetings, we have invited specifically the technical working group for Reimagine, you all, to these meetings. There has been some requests of inviting other people, and we are happy to have others join those meetings for the conversation. I think the more the merrier, although that might get a little unruly if we have 100 people say, but I do think the more the merrier. But we would ask that you all take the lead in sending out the invites to the other people, just so we make sure that we are not missing someone on our end. So our goal will be to make sure that our technical working group is invited. And if you would like to add people to that invite list, please go ahead and do that. And I know that there were several people that reached out to me and said, can we add this person or this person? And so anyway, we were able to meet today, and our approach will be asking you to please forward the meetings as appropriate.
And we're also planning on providing you all the meetings. So if you were interested in another service sector, please feel free to join that as well.
Yes, good. And then Julie or Bill, do you want to talk at all about the morphing of the rebuilding services subgroup and these groups together?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, is Bill out there?
Sure. I think, as we, like most of you who participated in some of the original rebuilding service group meetings, I think we had one or two of them. As we're getting into talking about, specific, more geographically based changes, we thought it was better to kind of break it up. So that is one of the reasons why we're kind of we're calling morphing the rebuilding services working group from one meeting into 5. We may be bringing everybody back together kind of at the end of the 3 meetings. We're still kind of mulling that over, but I think we just thought it was a better forum versus having, everybody talking about everybody else's changes, because especially this next round where we're going to get into route level changes, I think it's important to have, a dialogue around those that are kind of geographically based and, have consistency with the routes. So that's our approach.
Yes, that's just right. And so this next meeting, our goal is to have route by route recommendations for each of the service sectors to look at. So you'll be able to see, and I don't know that we'll go through every single one, but those that have sort of substantive changes, we'll be sure to look at those. Matthew, I see somebody popped in over on the team, so you grab them. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's good for that. Oops, I see a comment. Will the routes be named for each sector meeting? Sarah, help me. What do you mean?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. It sounds like you'll talk about individual routes in these meetings, and there are routes that may cross boundaries. Yes. So I'm just hoping it'll be clear which routes will be talked about, and if it will be talked about in multiple sectors, that adjoining sectors will be able to join that conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sarah. There's obviously a lot that cover different sectors. So, right now what we have is a every single route defined. That's where we're starting. But I think to your point, there's going to be some that cross over. So I'll take that into account as we sort of divide and conquer on those. And we probably have to have the conversation sometimes in 2 or sometimes maybe even 3 different service sectors.
We will also talk about rail in all 5 of them, since rail is regional in nature.
Yes, good. So we did want to give you a little update as well on the schedule for this, because there's a lot of pieces and parts. So We flagged in here, the third column down here is that second round of service sector meetings that I just described. Before we have those, RTD staff will be meeting with the board, each of the board members, to talk about and make sure that they are up to speed on the recommendations that are as they stand right now. Then after we have the meetings with you all, we'll be soliciting some public input. So this is more the traditional process that RTD goes through when they make route level changes. So that will start in early January. Then there'll be a board update on the proposed May 2022 service changes. So what we'll be talking about when we meet on the second meeting is what we anticipate being put in place for 2027 at this point. So this is the budget and hopefully the workforce that will be available in 2027. So we'll be phasing in from now until 2027. So phase one of that will be what gets discussed in January 2022 for implementation later in the year. Then we'll review the May 2022 service changes and the 2027 SOP route level changes with the public and customers January and February, and then board adoption of that 2022 service changes and the 2027 SOP is expected in March of 2022. So that was a long, I don't know if that description was better. I actually think it's probably better just to read the slide. but anyway, it sort of gives you a step-by-step process because there's several things going on. There's both the 2027 SOP, which is what we're working on here. And then there's a first phase of that needs to go through the process, get public comment, be adopted by the board. So anyway, that helps to line that out. So other thoughts, questions, suggestions for us on that? I don't think I see anything in the chat. So let's just go ahead and move into our next item. So the mobility plan for the future, the next, hour or so, we're going to talk about different aspects of the mobility plan for the future. As you know, we've been talking about, where does RTD stand today? What does the future look like? And how do we respond to that future? And of course, in the middle of our project, we had a hiccup that really made us think critically about what does the future really hold? Now that we've seen how the pandemic has changed ridership, has changed travel patterns. So, it's an opportunity for us to dig into that. So we're really trying to lay down some strategies and recommendations that we think make RTD solid moving forward and resilient moving forward, even in a space where nobody ever has a crystal ball, right? Like we never know exactly what the future holds. So we want to make sure that we're making recommendations that make sense across a breadth of futures. This is good practice for RTD regardless. So today we're going to talk about, and I think the next slide starts to step us into recommendations that we are preliminary recommendations, I should say, that we are making around customer engagement and mobility as a service. And Amy is going to step us through those.
All right, so as I do this, and I'm going to step us through both the customer engagement and on-demand mobility. And I wanted to set the stage again with sort of some future side. So as we think about the future, we are really sort of looking at three potential futures: that the world is moving into an on-demand way, that we have our high capacity services in our systems, but the world is also, and the customer expectations want their mobility when they want it, how they want it. And they want to be able to have it as a seamless experience and how they deliver that, which also puts an onus upon the agency to be able to more effectively manage the supply, but also the demand in how they manage this entire experience from a customer perspective. And then that puts us to the third future, which really is that of the mobility integrator. And during our scenario process, and what we'll talk about a little bit later here, is that in all of our scenarios, from the positive outcome scenarios to the ones that have a little bit more challenge and negative outcomes, that the group very much saw the role of a mobility integrator as being critical to RTD's future. And that's what this is about, this particular section. What does it mean to be a mobility integrator, and how do we elevate the customer engagement and really mobility as a service outcomes? And so when you see this, the core of what mobility engagement really means, and I want to highlight sort of goal number one, is about that seamless customer experience. So if you could flip to the next slide. So when we talk about mobility as a service. And I think that we all have sort of certain understandings about what we think about. But what I want to do is I want to highlight the core of what it is. The real core of it is, what are the platforms and the tools by which we engage our customers and creating that mobility experience and that seamlessness of that experience. And for us, you're going to see some recommendations here that might seem a little not as future forward, and yet they are entirely future forward, because what they are doing is they are laying the groundwork organizationally and the partnerships with the public as a way to be able to continue to move towards the future. And so the first recommendations that we have are really about how we elevate and assure that customer excellence is at the absolute core of what RTD does. And I think that we can all say, well, you know, this has been a focus. We've always been focused on our customers. But what we're really suggesting is that we formalize mobility as a service and the concept of integrating customer experience in as a core function of the organization. So what does that mean? What that means is that we're suggesting that we move towards creating essentially a 5-year vision that capitalizes on both the organizational structure as well as the programmatic structure that allows us to think about how we interface with our customers. And what that means is the customers and their experience and how they plan and book and pay for all sorts of mobility choices, those that are provided by R2D and maybe even those that are not. How we integrate with the customer in regards to their experience, let's say if they're calling our 511 systems and like, how we continue to move in the process by which, you know, we are assessing our customers' value of our system, the net promoter scores and the like. But really establishing a 5-year process that allows us to define what that means organizationally and how we integrate it. Right now, there's a lot of disparate approaches on how we take and handle the customer experience in R2D, and we're talking about how we align that under a single group. And Phil, I'm going to get to your questions as we go through this. Are we counting customers with those with some level of service coverage in the next 5 years or all? And yeah, let's get into that question. The second thing that we're talking about organizationally as we look forward is when we think about a lot of the core, it's about trip planning, trip payment, and continuing to create a platform and a customer engagement process that allows us to interact with our customers in a seamless basis. There are a lot of methods and approaches right now that are happening nationally and internationally, where there are organizational models that are taking that role of mobility integration and keeping the transit agency as a core partner in that, but moving it into actually a consolidated regional collaboration, whether it be a joint venture, public-private partnership, nonprofit effort, where the organizational structure of how we do mobility integration is actually a different kind of model. And so we've talked a little bit about some models there and some models that are, for instance, happening in Pittsburgh, for instance, where they are doing integrated trip planning between the city and the transit agency and a nonprofit organization, even modeling new models of universal basic mobility, for instance, in funding. So that one seems a little high level, but let me get into something then a little bit more specific on the user interface. So the reality is that RTD has started a lot when it comes to how we think about trip planning and payment platforms. But there are many of them. We have our smart mobility planning. We have our next ride planning. We just launched our parking relationship with parking.com so people can pay for their parking in a mobile way. And as we think about the integration of that, what we are suggesting is that RTD continue absolutely in doing 2 things. Number one, that they continue to develop an RTD-owned customer engagement process, that they continue to think about how they integrate all of those different tools in a seamless technology platform. And at the same time, with an eye towards equity and accessibility, continue to think about how people who do not have access to smartphones and the others continue to tap into that seamless experience. So that is one. The second piece, though, to that recommendation is that RTD is leading in a way of how to integrate their services and their systems as part of other third-party platforms. Uber, Transit, Google is starting to do integrations with Transit Pay as well as parking and the like. And we're suggesting right now that RTD continue on both of those paths. The reason that we think it's critical to continue on both of those paths is actually to the bullet that is on the top of that. Customer account management is absolutely the future when we think about customer engagement. And what customer account management means is that Amy Ford has an account with RTD, and that account allows me to be able to go forward and deduct, for instance, a payment when I want to ride on the bus, Maybe FHU is providing me an employee discount or an employee rate that allows me to give transit dollars into me. Maybe I'm also a person who qualifies for a low income subsidy in regards to my account and how that works. The concept of account management, which is something that RTD does not have currently, but is starting to move forward, is the future of where RTD goes and how it integrates with customers. And we have, these are very brief recommendations, but we have a series of thoughts about how we continue to move forward in an account-based management system, how you continue to create the opportunity for those programs, those subsidies, the integration of other mobility services into an account, the idea of being able to build to incentives. For instance, maybe Amy Ford also gets, hey, a $10 discount, just like I do on my Uber or Lyft account to say, hey, ride transit today. But that is the back end to be able to enable all of this. You can flip to the next slide. A couple of the other things that we're talking about right now in mobility as a service and customer engagement is how you actually transition as a public transit agency and how we think about that role as a mobility integrator through partnerships. And we're going to talk more about this in the mobility on demand pieces of it. But really what we're talking about here is how do you actively build interoperability with different mobility providers? And the core piece to this is about active interoperability. So thinking about the engagement related to our platforms, the trip planning and the payment, how you actively start integrating other mobility services and tools to serve as that mobility integrator into those platforms, both on those that are RTD owned. And I see the question there, which means those assets that RTD has the core of the management of the customer experience versus third parties where the RTD system is sharing its information, its back-end integrations, so people can also access mobility choice, but still also access the RTD system. So I can get into that a little bit more. But actively build interoperability means that you're actively pursuing to build those relationships into your platforms, that you're actively planning on how you create interoperability on your physical assets. For instance, removing the concepts of permits on our park and ride so that we can more actively engage our bike shares, how we think about car shares work in this space, how we think about different program efforts. And we'll talk about some of this more in the on-demand mobility. The last piece of the recommendation, and this one might seem interesting as we think about it, but how do you actually incentivize demand on the system? This is about creating access and desire. And this is more than just marketing. And how do we do integrated marketing? It's how do we actually think about a strategic vision for demand generation? How are we drawing people into the system? How do we integrate that with our operations? How do we integrate that within our marketing? How do we create that and advance it through account-based systems and account-based customer management? And how do we draw and create personalized approach to thinking about incentivizing demand on the system and growing it? And that requires, I think, some very proactive and directed thought, and is a direction that we think we should be going strongly. And that last piece of it, as I mentioned before, that the account-based system as being one of the really critical pieces to the future is how we deliver that. So I use the example of mobility integration. When we talk now, if we have an account-based system, and Amy Ford has her account, with mobility integrator serving as a role, perhaps the capacity for RTD and using these account systems through the integration with mobility choice and our partners, other mobility service providers and such, allows us to continue to think about how we serve as the mobility wallet, if you will, for the region. That tool and that system has the ability to create those integrations and those customer interfaces for mobility choices for everyone in the RTD region. So those are some of the recommendations that we're looking at. And then I'd love to take some of those questions as we go through that. And so Kent, I see that you asked about what's RTD owned and not an existing vendor. RTD owned is RTD white labeled. RTD has the relationship with the customer. RTD is the one who, whether it's through their vendor or otherwise, is doing has the service where they have the direct relationship with the customer and how they're doing the trip planning, the trip payment system and the like. Third party means very similar to, let's say, the relationship that RTD is engaged with Uber. It's an Uber-owned asset. They are the ones who are doing the integration and the direct relationship with the customer, that the customer can access a variety of mobility choices such as RTD bus services through that app. And what we are suggesting is that both of those approaches continue to move forward, because I think that it is critical that the agency continue to place themselves at every opportunity on mobility choice. And it's one that frankly is leading somewhat in the country and frankly around the world. RTD's models are talked about quite a bit. I think it's one that we want to continue. And Brian, thanks, you're popping in on some of those. NextRide is RTD owned. Your mobile ticketing is RTD owned. Transit is absolutely a third-party access. And so part of this from an organizational perspective is also continuing to have the staff and the support who have the knowledge and the capacity to do this. The data experts, the data integration analysts and others.
Amy, did you touch on Phil's comment up above?
No, I haven't. So Phil, let me come in. Are we counting customers of those with some level of service coverage in the next 5 years or all those within the district? So Phil, you want to just build on that question just a little bit and ask, and then I can respond.
Yeah, sure. I was just talking a little bit about, and it sounds like you're doing it when you talk about the Uber example and kind of the third party piece of this. So that's,
Yeah.
I think you're answering the question, but I'm just trying to make sure that we're not just looking at those who have some level of coverage on your map there, on the previous map, and we show lines and we show flex ride services,
Right.
but that we're making sure that we're covering the district. It's hard for me to see that we're covering the whole district with this idea, but especially like the mountain areas in Boulder and Jefferson County. So just make sure we're cognizant of those folks too.
I understand. And yeah, when we talk about these services and the customer integration, both from a digital customer integration, but also then from those who do not always have access to the digital assets to be able to do that. What are our
Exactly, yeah.
strategies to build
Right.
that? And that's a really important piece to this. And we talk quite a bit, and I could show some other slides when we look at RTD's system as it's being built right now, is also taking into account what are the relationships with storefronts, sales, et cetera. How can you deliver these kinds of seamless experiences that don't always have to be off an app? What can you do with a card or maybe even a small bracelet you wear that has no touch access into validators that have the ability to sort of track, and track's probably the wrong word, but follow what the customers are doing when they're debiting out, for instance, that mobility choice that they're taking, whether it be on a bus or whether they've chosen to ride, a scooter to get to that bus. So we've been talking about how we build all of those pieces in. But at the core of it, and I know that is how we continue to move to an individuated account-based system is, and remember the goal of what we're trying to accomplish with the Reimagine is how do you prepare for 2030 and then for 2050? And what's the pathway and the roadmap to get there? And what are the organizational programs or even structures that we want to be able to put in play that allow us to go to sort of that end game? And end game in in this one is account-based customer systems. That's a big part of the end game.
Amy,
Dave, yeah,
Oh.
go ahead. Sorry, someone else had a question.
no, that's okay. I just jumped in. This is Andrew from Downtown Denver Partnership. I had a question about, anytime you talk about integrating with private transportation services, you always open yourself up to the risk of different quality of service, or maybe the service goes away altogether. How does this model, how do you see this model kind of helping to provide some insurance with that? If we're really leaning into that integration, how do we get those little assurances that we still protect the public good?
Yeah, and Brian, I see you popped off speaker there. So if you wanted to talk first, and then I'll follow in.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks for that question. It's a big issue to RTD because our relationship with our customers, that there's a term that's used in the industry called disintermediation, and that's where there's another party who is interfacing with your customers, but you ultimately are accountable for the experience.
Right.
And that's one of the things, Andrew, we carefully evaluate before we pursue any third-party arrangement, and why I believe Amy can expand on this. She's recommending that for a certain core number of these interactions with our customers that we own it and that we don't rely on a third party who, for example, you're right, it might not be sustainable and resilient and equitable and everything that's important to us. That's a key, very, very significant issue and it's why some of the things that we'd like to do, frankly, they falter for that very reason. But thanks for that question.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, we know that the market pressures, if you will, of continuing to aggregate and create integrated mobility options is going to continue. And that's a good thing, I think, is what we're suggesting. And I think that it's important for RTD to do is the sophistication of how we have our customer integration strategies aligned, the people who can do them, and the alignment with the technical tools and then the outcomes that we're looking for. So that's a lot of words, but the important piece is that we have the people and the strategy in play that we can say, we absolutely are pursuing a third-party strategy. These are our priorities and how we do those integrations. And we are absolutely still pursuing our own strategy. And that may seem like duplication, but we think it's really important. But underpinning both of those strategies, which is really the number one boss strategy, is an account-based system that allows us to directly interact with our customers, that allows for improved on our data analytics, improved opportunities for incentives. Dave Krusninger, I see that you talk about ozone incentive days, sports and cultural events. Take, for instance, the budget that Governor Polis just put together, where he's talking about integrating, I forget how much, X million dollars right now to incentivize people to travel on transit during high ozone days. And that actually could be a layered system, not just writ large, but individually assigned into our different customer accounts and the like. So that tool is the umbrella underneath all of it. And underneath all of that is the organizational structure that can consolidate this entire piece of it in experience-wise to be able to manage that more effectively. Carol, you've got your hand raised.
So maybe you'll talk about this more later in the mobility on demand, but can you talk a little bit about how this experience would be for people who are accessoride users?
Yes, and actually, we are going to talk about that more in the mobility on demand section, because there are going to be two levels of integration here that right now, as you know, we have a variety of different ways that you can access your services through accessoride and like. And we're talking about how you create one seamless experience for all customers, both on the customer experience part of that, that is focused on accessoride, ADA accessibility, and frankly, universality of design and access to different mobility choices. And we know that not all mobility choices have the ability to serve all passengers. And so that's a really critical part to that. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more on the mobility on demand too, when we talk about integrated service operations. But so I'm going to hold on that question too and come back to it then on the other. Are there other questions? And you guys, I as we sit and we look at this, I think a lot of us around the room, we're all very experienced in transit and like are nodding and going, yep, this all makes sense. And hey, maybe this doesn't seem like rocket science. And I think the short answer to that is it's really important to know how we build our base, how we add to our base, and how we continue to grow upon it. And the reality is very honestly, RTD has been doing a really good job of building some of these bases and starting that. And we forget that sometimes, I think, when we've got a lot of other things going on and a lot of other issues. But what we're really recommending is that we elevate this and we prioritize it and we put it at the top of the core of how RTD moves forward organizationally and structurally as it moves forward in this kind of integrated customer experience. And that's one of the core pieces of recommendations. All right, let's move us to on demand. So when I talked about the future pieces of it in the future set in the mobility integrator, really the goal of the on-demand mobility is how do we continue to improve access to transit? How do we continue to improve access to mobility choices? And then how do we think about that in an integration of first mile, last mile outcomes? So you see that this particular grouping of strategies is really pulling together all three of those and building upon some already heavy thought that was put into the first last mile outcomes piece. Again, the goal of this is then about that. So if you were to have sort of four buckets, you have your fixed route bucket, which is always first and foremost our high capacity transit budget. You have your customer experience bucket. which is all about the integrated platforms and how people access their mobility choice. You have your mobility integration bucket, which is your multimodal integrations, which is effectively your infrastructure, your parking, your data, and other tools that allow for this whole experience. And your fourth then is really about on-demand mobility. And that is about creating, again, this flexible mobility experience. So if you flip to the next slide, what we're talking about from a recommendations perspective, again, you'll see that we followed in the same process. What's our organizational recommendations, our service partnership recommendations? We're going to have some user interface, i.e. the user experience, and then demand. Organizationally, we've already started some of these discussions. And in fact, those of you and those who've been participating in our mobility on demand service operations discussions are starting to see some of these recommendations play themselves out a little bit. What we're recommending is that we create a very definitive structure that allows us to plan on-demand mobility service operations. We have some early thoughts about potentially expanding our flex ride zones, for instance, into on-demand or mod service zones. Within that mod service zones, what we recognize is that there are a lot of options on how we can continue to look at services. And I'm going to talk, and you're going to sort of see this mixed between, and I'm going to go between sort of organizational and service as we talk about our recommendations here. But within those mod zones, we know that there are continued demands and expectations from our customers and others to create on-demand mobility services that really serve as this role of mobility integration that will allow us to meet the needs of our customers. And that our local communities have a very clear engagement process that we define and establish in how we plan for those service operations, how we think about it, how we establish them, how we pay for them. So I want to just go down to one bullet really quickly on the service partnership. So what we're proposing is that as we get ready for this future of on-demand, that we establish MOD service operation zones, that we establish a full comprehensive menu of service options that with our local partners that would be allocated through a local engagement process that would be the best mix of how we provide services in that MOD zone. Now, when I say that, and when I say menu of services, that can range all the way from small fixed route services, micro transit services, how we think about first mile, last mile services with ride hailing options, partnerships with other active transportation modes such as bike share, scooter share, and the like. Interestingly, what we are proposing actually from an organizational structure perspective is that RTD helps to provide that base level of menu of services, that it helps working with the local partners to create through a negotiated procurement, partnership development process, relationships with those types of mobility providers that allows you to have effectively sort of on-call systems and the like where we can mix and match some of those services in those operation zones. Now, I know that we have already been doing that and RTD has already been doing that in some hits. Stuart, I see you're on the call. How do we think about microtransit services, for instance, in the Cherry Creek region, right? If Karen Stewart were on the call, I know that we're starting to think about looking at a small bike share partnership up in our northern area. But creating a more systemic approach to how we create the options of those consolidated services so that they're available as part of a menu of options and menu of services that we then coordinate and consolidate with our locals and creating a very local engagement process. So that all sounds great. That's fantastic if RTD sort of uses its capacity and its partnerships and the like to be able to do that. How do we pay for that? And therein lies the question. So in thinking about options related to a fiscally constrained budget and the like, what we are recommending are a couple of things. Number one, we are recommending that we rethink and look at the opportunity to create a grant match program that RTD would fund, where we would create a local match program where RTD is putting dollars into the local MOD services, potentially matched by the locals. What would be the funds for that grant match program, you ask? We're also potentially looking at how we reimagine our flex ride services. And so we are going to see in the service operation stuff that we're going to start talking about the flex ride services, but the team and the group There is a lot of evolution in how to more effectively manage different kinds of microtransit and on-demand DRT types of services. And there's an openness and a willingness to sort of take and put these out on the table to work with the industry and with others to say, how could we do this more effectively, more cost effectively, with better customer service and outcomes, and how do we think about that? So those are two potentials for funding options. So dollars potentially coming from what's already allocated in the flex rides, how you would create a local grant match program that RTD is funding and collaborating with their locals as you define the services to how to pay for them. And another third option that we also sat and started exploring is how do you think about the different revenues that, for instance, you might generate in reuse and reutilization of our parking and our parking opportunities. And in doing so, if we are generating funds, for instance, in leasing and or reuse and or sale, it's how you would almost create a transportation improvement or community district where dollars from that area stay in that area, let's say from the reuse of a parking lot and park and ride, and that those dollars are allocated to delivering first mile, last mile services and others. So these are just concepts that are being preliminarily talked about, but we recognize, as everyone does, that the funding piece for these strategies is an important element to that. Second, lastly, to support the organizational structure pieces of this, we're also proposing that, again, organizationally, that there is an MOD community program liaison in the special services group whose sole role and responsibility is to develop the partnerships with different mobility services and options providers, to create the parameters, to develop those relationships also then with the locals to be able to create that support. Now, we know that some cities, Dave said you're on the call, so Denver obviously already has very existing relationships with different types of microtransit services and others. And these are service programs that you all may have well at hand, and how you integrate these services into this overall mod zone and working with RTD is one thing. There are other communities who may not have all of those support services and capacity to do some of that kind of relationship building with different kinds of mobility service providers. And this person, this liaison, would be the person who would do a lot of that work. So those are some of the ideas organizationally. You can see that as we frame that into then the service partnerships, it's how do we create that menu of services? But we also recommend strongly that we continue to move forward in pilot projects related to on-demand services. And this coming from the first last mile recommendations, but then also from the future set, which is on-demand automated services. Those are pilots that are actually even starting to happen in other cities. Arlington, for instance, in Texas is doing something like this. And we think it's critical that RTD continue to move forward doing some of these pilots. Another pilot is also looking at how we do regional wayfinding and continuing to broaden the demand side on your on-demand tools and resources. And these are coming off of our first last mile recommendations. So if you could flip to the next slide and I'll finish this section up. When we talk about the user interface and the operations, and Carol, getting back to your question, we are recommending that we start reimagining again the operations of our on-demand services that are already currently happening. And one of those is to think about how we coordinate between FlexRide, Access-a-Ride, and upcoming microtransit systems with single software, dispatch, scheduling, and even coordinated vehicle usage. One, to create efficiencies of use for the system, cost savings, but also a better and more calibrated approach to the customer experience. And we think that there is big opportunity in that, especially as we move forward in the future, a lot of different services that can enable us to do that. That also then dovetails into these customer and this infrastructure interface piece that I was talking to you guys about before. How do you ensure that the infrastructure, especially on park and rides and others, have the capacity to integrate different kinds of mobility choice and options? We already have our mobility hub interface and typologies. Obviously, groups like Denver are starting to build out their mobility hubs. Others are moving into this. And this is a really critical juncture now with how we continue to use the frameworks and the typologies to actively plan out those integrations. And that's where RTD wants to, we want RTD to continue to go. Lastly, again, on the demand management side, you'll just again see the overlap back into the MOS section, where we're talking about how we continue with these customer integration platforms, again, with a focus on equity and accessibility. Those are really critical elements. And again, focused on that account-based system. So really quick run through, sorry, there's like 15 slides that I've boiled down into these two as we get going into that. But Thoughts
It's a
and
lot
questions?
of good, yeah, it's a lot of really good information. I'd like to pause here and see if, I don't see anything new in the chat. Mike, I see you're on camera. Did you have a thought?
I do. So Amy, I'm just having a hard time following
Yeah,
that 90,000 foot level stuff. So give it to me like I live in Evergreen.
yeah.
Like what is going to be different if I
So-
need to get on Evergreen and there's no bus service now? And
Right.
so I'm a FlexRide kind of likely customer. So
That's exactly
what are
right.
you doing that you don't do now? What are you going to undo that you currently do now? Like I just need a much more tangible version of all that.
What we're saying is this, if you're in the Evergreen area, you may be overlaid with a mobility on demand zone. In that mobility on demand zone, we're going to be working directly with you through the local planning regions to say, here's a menu of service options on how we can best meet some of the mobility needs that we have in the area, working with you on that, Mike. And you're going to say, I think our answer is that we need microtransit services that allow our residents to go to these 4 primary locations in our MOD zone. And then we need an additional car share service system that allows us to access different opportunities. I'm making that up. Those relationships will be relationships with maybe existing providers and others that RTD will be helping to develop, broker, create as an on-call, and that we work collectively with you on how to deliver those services and then how to pay for them through a variety of different sources, maybe through a joint grant partnership program, through facilitated dollars that maybe you bring to the table, but that RTD also puts on the table with a third-party provider. So that's the organizational side of it. And that system is then underpinned because then your users are accessing all of those tools through the customer integration platforms that RTD is continuing to offer, because they have taken all of those services and created them in a consolidated, seamless system that allows someone to dial it up whenever and wherever they are.
So so on the customer side, I live in Evergreen. I need to get to the grocery store. I pick up the phone and dial someone at RTD, or go on my computer or open my app to the RTD app, and I say destination, and it's going to say, the flex ride will be, whizzing past, the major arterial in 20 minutes. There's a scooter 3 blocks away. Walk to the scooter to the flex ride to the grocery store. Good luck.
Yep.
Okay.
That could be the way it would go.
Okay. Cool.
And in an integrated partnership with you all, that maybe is that you as a planner have said, these are the things our residents do need. They do need access to be able to go to the grocery store. And guess what? We're really missing the capacity to do that right now. So maybe what we want to create is a more dynamic microtransit system that allows us to do some of that in the area. And that's part of the menu of service options that RTD also would be supporting and helping to evaluate, broker, and potentially pay for in collaboration with you.
Yeah, and since climate change is going to give us endless fall, you could scooter in Evergreen in November.
That's right. So there'll be no more snow.
Bye.
Got it.
So we
Yeah, that
have,
helped. Thanks.
you're good, thank you. So we have a lot else of other great things to cover here, and I want to make sure we have time for them. If you have, I feel like that was a whole lot of information from Amy. So if you have other questions and comments, please put them in the chat, or even after the meeting, please send us, questions. We're happy to follow up.
Yeah, and Holly and Amy, for what it's worth, I think this is the beginning of answering the why don't I have a bus coming to me when bus is the wrong mode.
Yes.
So that's the conversation that needs to be had in the hinterlands and the less dense, because you've got to stop sending buses where they make no sense, because that money doesn't exist. And that conversation needs to be had with, well, no, a bus isn't coming. That doesn't mean RTD doesn't exist because you're in the district. So here's another way. It's a couple of different modes, but we're with you and we will help you get from here to there, even though the giant bus is not going to be your friend.
Is not the solution. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great.
Cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, so our next item up here that I think will also be of interest, I hope, to the group is our initial evaluation of the and findings from the zero emission fleet and facilities. And Cliff, with our partner with WSP, is going to give us an overview of that.
Speaking of climate change.
Yeah, right. You know what, Cliff, talk again. Your sound is kind of funny.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, but it's pretty distorted. Is it distorted for others?
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty distorted, Cliff. Do you have another audio mechanism we can use?
Is that better?
Well, yes, but now you're quiet. There's no winning, Cliff. Try me one more time.
Is this better?
You're pretty quiet.
Okay, let me try this one more time.
Ooh, I hear rustling. That's a good sign.
Now,
Yeah, it's a little loud and distorted, but I think it's going to work for us.
I wonder if I can turn it down.
Ooh, that's
good.
reasonable. That's
Okay.
good. It's good.
So I'll try to be quiet. My usual subdued self, put it that way. So we modeled two different scenarios in our modeling, where we've been actively at work doing performance modeling, and as you can recall, we took the 2019 data service structure and used that to show how battery electric buses and the investigation into how fuel cell buses might do on the service network circa 2019. We don't think it's going to be a whole lot different in terms of at least how any structural changes to the network might augur for the performance. What will change, of course, will be the evolution of the technology, and I can get into that in a little bit. So the key differences then are the overall energy consumption on a variety of both geographic and topographic and other sort of built environment factors on the route network, okay? And typically what is the biggest drivers of this are, climatic differences as well as distance-based and topo-based differences, so that the energy consumption primarily from the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system and from the propulsion system. As I go into this, I'll explain a little bit further, but the scenarios basically will also be used to inform the fleet replacement needs, where there might be en route chargers, where we might look at fuel cell buses as a potential replacement in the fuels in the mix as well. And all of that, of course, drives capital improvements and all these other things that will happen later on. So, key findings. We did two scenarios, which are basically a typical scenario and then a conservative scenario of basically these buses don't perform as well in the dead of winter, the height of summer, and on really challenging routes. What we found was, in the typical scenario, 44% of the service blocks are not completed as a result of battery electric buses. And we also tried to project this in the future as well.
Can we pause here and just make sure that everyone knows what a service block is?
Yeah, good point. So a service block is basically pull in and pull out. And that block might serve different routes. So that bus driver in his assignments or her assignments in the morning might serve one part of the network, and then might go to another part of the network. But it's basically measured by the bus leaving the garage and the bus arriving back to the garage, a service block.
Perfect.
which means it could serve multiple routes. Typically, no, but it could, right? So anyway, the service blocks there, we plot that across the entire network using Denver's own data, and we determined that typical scenario, the average day, the average of the average day, a little bit less than half of the blocks completed with battery electric technology. A little bit more than half of them are. And in the conservative scenario, the percent not completed rises. And again, it's because of the conditions and because we're adding on some other things that challenge those batteries. Scenario that means that the buses will not complete that block. And then the percent not completed or completed actually reduces as well. In the next slide, we also working on the bus facility needs to support this fleet, where we're assessing the fleet and assessing the garages and how those facilities need to be modified. Is Kerry able to join us so that he can just?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Great. We have some technical difficulties that he resolved. So great. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I was seeing some questions in chat. I don't know if maybe.
Yeah. Did you want to answer those now? We can do that.
Sure. Yeah. While you're on this one, Cliff, maybe it makes sense to hit what does it mean? What does block not complete mean? Planned trips don't happen, or I think that's not quite right.
Right. So what we're assessing is performance of the. So it means basically that the bus dies. It doesn't. It successfully. It is not able to complete the service assignment. Okay. And so what that does in our recommendations is it drives the number of either opportunity chargers on the routes somewhere in the network that need to give them a charge to complete the block, or more buses are going to be needed to be able to go and complete that assignment than what the fleet currently, whether the size of the fleet currently. That's what that means.
Ron, does that answer your question? Yes, he gave us a thank you. Okay, super.
Okay. What else? Let's see.
I think that's all for now on that section.
Okay.
So, Carrie, I think you're covering this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So our report sort of builds in the opposite direction based on what Cliff has previously done, or what Cliff has accomplished. And so what we're looking at are the 7 facilities that house the actual buses, and then how those can be transitioned from a diesel fleet to a BEB fleet. And so we're looking at 7 facilities. We're looking at 3 RTD-owned facilities, and we're looking at 4 contractor-run facilities. And the graphic that you see here on the left is Platt, and the colors that we're showing there are basically sort of these implementation modules. It's basically modules of a number of buses that work with the electrical equipment. And in the case of Platt, we have 8 of these phases, and these can be used to inform bus procurement schedules. They can be used to inform construction, planning, and remodeling for the facility. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine what is a logical approach to implementing BEBs within the facility, how it can be done, the actual nuts and bolts of what equipment touches the bus to be able to charge it, if it's plug-in or if it's pantograph or whatever. And then on top of that, also the sort of, nuts and bolts of the electrical components, from basically receiving electrical from Excel in most cases to actually going and hooking up to the building, and how all that can be accomplished at a high level. And so that's done. Again, this is Platt that we're showing here on the left-hand side, but we've done this for all facilities. And
Stages are because you don't want to do anything to disrupt existing service while we're
right,
doing
exactly. And so, yeah, exactly. So what we've done is we've considered, you know, for example, in this blue stage here, or this sort of purple blue stage, all of those buses that are diesel buses would have to be moved from those spots so that we could then, for a period of time, construct the infrastructure needed to charge the buses. Where did those diesel buses go in that meantime? And so we have some consideration for that. We've looked at that. And then once that's done, you know, how do we move on to the next stage and so on? You know, how many of these stages can be accomplished simultaneously versus, you know, can we only do maybe one stage? Do we have to have off-site parking for some of these buses? In some cases, at some facilities, we may have to look at that. So that's what we've looked at there.
That's great, and a lot of detail to help RTD understand the cost and viability, feasibility, constructability of moving to this technology. I do want to go back. Brian put a great comment in the chat, and he talks about RTD owns 1,034 vehicles that service 1,087 weekday blocks out of 7 divisions. So those are what Carrie was referring to there. Now, Cliff, when we're talking about that 1,000 vehicles, obviously this varies depending on the division and what the assignment of the vehicle is, like how long the route is, the terrain, the weather. And it depends on whether we have that typical scenario you talked about or that conservative scenario you talked about. But when we talk about the volume of buses, can you speak a little to, like, what are we talking about? If tomorrow you at the, you know, snap of your fingers change to a battery electric fleet, what are we talking about in volume of buses?
Right. So, I mean, Brian's point is actually, you know, exactly the point. And that's that, you know, you're going to need roughly 60% more buses, you know, in order to, and that's just the typical scenario. When climate change happens, you know, later on in the 2050 horizon, or, you know, presumably technology will get a little better. And so in the iterative phases of this and the transition planning that we'll do, we'll also try to project where this is going from a technological standpoint. But, you know, everything happening just now, as you said, Holly, it could be as many as doubling roughly the number of buses that are needed to complete the service blocks as presently constituted.
Right.
Cliff,
Okay,
when you do
has
an
some
analysis
trickle-
like,
sorry.
I'm sorry, Harley. Cliff, when you do an analysis like this, could you just briefly, for the group, summarize the effect of battery degradation and how that fits into your analysis as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we also model, we try to challenge the battery in the simulation model that says, okay, that battery will degrade over its warranted life. And so it degrades by as much as 10 or 20%. And we'll model that. And it's part of what we consider to be the, particularly in the conservative scenario, that battery is going to degrade.
On average right now, Cliff, just if we were buying these today, not giving out dollar amounts, but say for a typical 40-foot bus, how much of a premium is there for a battery electric vehicle over, say, a clean diesel per unit?
It's at least $150,000 is the margin. It may be as high as $200,000, depending on, you know, how much warranty you want to buy, the size of the battery, other sorts of things, other bells and whistles, right? But it's essentially $150,000 to $200,000 delta. Now, we think that because of the requirements on diesel technology and the volume increase in expected battery demand, we think that delta will narrow. Some say as early as, say, 2030. I don't believe it. I think it's more like the mid 2030s before that really begins to narrow substantially. And we, you know, in the cost modeling, we'll do some of that. We'll show, you know, that those costs in that transition horizon do narrow.
And Cliff, this analysis by nature can't include the what we call the cutaway vehicles, the flex ride vehicles, and the paratransit. Because are there any battery electric Altoona tested vehicles even available yet for the mass market?
These are like what they call in a trial condition, like leading questions, but they're good, they're great. So that's true. There is nothing yet Altoona tested that's a battery electric technology. That said, there are a number of, the good news is that there are a number of platforms that are being announced as we speak. For example, one of the most common platforms in conventional drivetrain technology, the chassis, the Ford chassis, they have announced a battery electric version of that. And so we see very soon the onset of a whole bunch of medium range vehicles coming on the market as a result of some of these pretty significant announcements very quickly. When they'll get in the pipeline for Altoona testing, that's a little bit of a different story. But we see at least the technology coming to the market very soon.
A couple more questions, and then I'm going to let us move to the next piece of the facilities discussion.
Yeah, we need to talk about the actual assessments, don't we?
Yeah,
Yes.
right. So maintenance costs, Cliff, Rick asked about, he said, but maintenance cost is less, right?
So I am not convinced personally that the jury is still out on maintenance costs, and I'll tell you why. While there is, no maintenance or little maintenance associated with, drivetrain related componentry, and the electric motors are very reliable and have a lot of have less maintenance. The battery conditioning maintenance costs associated with battery cell balance and heating and babysitting the batteries, for lack of a better way of explaining this, it's still nascent enough technology where we really don't have a good handle yet on just what those maintenance costs are. And I also am skeptical that there are maintenance cost savings based on previous technological evolution. There just seems to be like these unforeseen maintenance costs associated with new technology as it arises. So the jury's still out.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Cliff. And then one more question, and I'm going to have us move on. Phil asked about biogas, biomethane, and why that isn't included. I do think we have looked at, other than a straight up electric bus, you have looked at some other technologies as well, but help me here.
Yeah, I mean, our scope as directed by RTD was more around electrification. Now there is some interesting literature in the industry about how renewable natural gas could, serve as a from a wells to wheels perspective, depending on where a grid gets its energy. But it was kind of out of the window what we were looking at.
Yeah.
But I could certainly provide anybody who's interested into some very interesting reports that have been done in the market, showing some promise of renewable natural gas in that area. Now, that said, it comes with its own set of infrastructure, challenges, right? So.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think that is terrific information. More to come on that, but that gives us some framework about what we have learned so far. Let's move into the bus and rail facility assessment and talk a little bit about what you learned there.
Yeah, so back in July, we took a site tour of the commuter rail facility as well as the light rail facilities and talked with staff to understand their operations and really inspect where there was room for expansion and stuff like that. So starting with the commuter rail facility, staff indicated to us that they were at capacity. They wouldn't be able to handle more trains there. And looking at photos and drawings and walking around the facility ourselves, we agree with that. If you look at the site, like the picture here, there isn't really any location to add additional storage tracks without acquiring any new properties. And then even if new properties were acquired, there wouldn't be a good way to lay out those tracks that would keep the yard efficient. So the recommendation would be if there was more vehicles that were to be added to the commuter rail operations, that a new facility would most likely need to be constructed. Then for maintenance bays at this facility, right now they are good. They have the amount of bays needed to maintain the vehicles that they store here. Now, if they were to get more, they would obviously need to expand the facility and create new bays. And especially right now, another reason why they have the amount of space that they do is they aren't doing any overhauls or big campaigns to replace parts, because this facility is only 6 years old. Now, 5-10 years from now, they're going to start doing more of those maintenance campaigns, which will require more tracks. And then you can move on to the next one. So for the light rail facilities, both of these are similar. They don't have the capacity to handle more trains without acquiring more property and adding new storage tracks. So the Elati facility, staff indicated to us that right now they handle 201 light rail vehicles, but really they can only handle 160. And after looking at the site and taking pictures and looking at the as-built drawings, we agree with what staff was indicating to us there. They also have issues with the storage or the congestion in the yard. So at the end of service, when vehicles are coming in, they have to do a lot of shuffling of trains, and that's just very inefficient how it is now. And so adding more trains would make it even worse than it already is. And then the Mariposa facility, they actually don't store any vehicles there. And that is the bottom picture on this slide. And as you can see, there isn't really any areas to add more tracks or allow this facility to store trains. This facility is also very old, and a lot of the equipment is obsolete. To upgrade this facility would cost a lot of money because it's just very old and outdated, and a lot of things would need to go into that. And again, they don't, because of the site constraints, they don't really have any room to add any more storage tracks or expand the building to increase their maintenance capacity. So again, like the commuter rail facilities, if more trains were to be added to the system, they'd most likely need to construct a new facility, ideally on like the opposite side of the light rail system. And this is where I'll hand it off to Carrie.
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to the rail maintenance facilities, we also looked at the bus maintenance facilities. And so that's going to include, again, the RTD-owned facilities, the 3 RTD-owned facilities, and 4 contractor-run facilities. And the purpose of this was to sort of form a baseline as to the current state of these facilities, and then be able to use that baseline to formulate, okay, a schedule for what needs to be improved going out to 2050. Currently, the state of good repair is reported to TAM, I think every 3 years, and we've gotten that information from RTD, and we're building upon that information, because really that sort of looks at, hey, look, this is what we plan on using some of these funds to replace this building, or to replace a portion of this building, or to replace this system at this building. And so we're able to use that information in addition to our sort of baseline assessment, and just expand upon it out to 2050 to be able to say, okay, for example, in 2035, this facility is going to need a new air conditioning system, or this facility is going to need a new infrastructure for supporting its, or for maintaining its vehicles, a new, for example, vehicle lifts or something of that nature. And so that's basically just a long-term schedule to be able to look down the street, to be able to look around the corner and see what's coming up, and to be able to anticipate some of those costs. In addition to that, we're also looking at a greenfield site. We're actually looking at what it would take in terms of a known number of capacity of buses for maybe a large facility, and then also maybe possibly a smaller facility, a new facility, sort of idealized facilities. How much land is going to be needed? What functions does that facility serve? How many buses would be housed at that facility? Would there be offices? Would there be, really nuts and bolts detail planning of sort of what this idealized facility could potentially look like? And that would be used, or could be used, to inform, all right, look, this is how many, of these facilities we may need. This is how much land we may need at some point in the future. And so that's what we're currently working on.
Ron, I see you have a hand up. Do you want to jump in?
If you don't mind, Holly, thanks. Ron Papsdorf for Dr. Cog. I on the rail maintenance facilities, I guess I'm struggling with a little bit, and I understand we are where we are, and as the system grows, we're going to have to kind of plan ahead for facilities. But I think it might be helpful for us to understand sort of how RTD got in this situation in the first place. And it feels like, I guess my initial reaction is, why wasn't RTD planning for these facility needs to accommodate the expansion of the rail system in the first place, rather than getting into this point where there's 3 facilities that basically can't accommodate any, in the case of light rail maintenance facility, can't even accommodate what we've got, let alone any expansion of the system. So, and again, I don't want to cast aspersions and go back and sort of rehash history. At the same time, if we're planning forward, we got to understand what happened that planning didn't happen in the first place, so we avoid the same mistakes again.
Let's not do that again. We know we're going to need some additional capacity. Let's make sure that we're thinking more broadly, perhaps, to accommodate future needs.
But I would like to understand sort of what are the key kind of factors that played into sort of getting into the situation that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that I can answer that, but we can find out, Ron, a little bit more about the history of the planning and the maintenance facility efforts, and get back to you on that. Carrie, do you want to wrap up this? I think you sort of covered it already, that you have reports coming that will provide some recommendations.
Yeah, unintentionally, I did sort of kind of cover this slide, but
Yeah.
I mean, we're currently working on these reports, both state of good repair, what we call a state of good repair out to 2050 for all the facilities, and then again a design criteria for greenfield sites. And we're looking at again, for a greenfield bus facility sites, we're looking at both kind of a large facility and maybe a small facility that could be kind of used as guidance for if you need multiple of these facilities, or if you need just one big facility, how that could be done. And those are reports we're currently working on.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I think we covered questions as we went along, but again, and I don't see any hands, so let's go ahead and move into partnerships. So this is another aspect of what we've been hearing a lot from our local agency partners. And so RTD is taking the challenge on this and is trying to be responsive. They are preparing a new partnership process, and they're just in the works of putting this together. And it's going to really cover how, when a local agency wants to come to the table to say, buy up service or share cost of service, if there is an innovative mobility pilot or some kind of third-party operations where perhaps you have a taxi program or Uber covering some of the demand and need in an area, what does the partnership structure look like when a local agency or RTD itself has an idea that should be put on the ground? So they're going to try and really line out those steps and talk about they refer to it here as the front door. So if you have an idea that you'd like to see put on the ground as a local agency, or perhaps a nonprofit or some kind of a provider who at RTD do you reach out to get in this process? And then does the process look like? And can I do this at any time? Can I approach RTD, 3 times a year? Maybe I can do it once a year. What is the process for getting in there? And what's the evaluation process to determine if RTD moves forward with this partnership or not? And what's the time frame for making the decisions? One of the other things that RTD has flagged is sometimes a partnership or an idea will come forward, and then there's a lot of different players. Sometimes you need people from IT, and you need people from customer service and service development. And so it's hard to, holding everybody accountable and the group accountable to moving through a process in a timely manner, because it can get, it's a large organization and it can get bogged down. So they've identified this opportunity to really streamline that process and try and help move those ideas through to get to a decision and move forward towards implementation. Their goal is to implement this new partnership program in the second quarter of 2022. And I would just put a flag out there that I think we've talked about these at our last meeting, that there are currently 15 partnerships right now on the ground that range from, working with the autonomous vehicles out in Golden to various flex rides and voucher programs for taxi service, partnerships with Uber. So there's a lot going on right now. And there's another 10 that are in the planning stage right now. So little organization structure to come. So I have questions up here. I don't know if I'm really going to be able to answer questions, but more I would like to hear if you have particular suggestions that should be taken into account as RTD starts to put some flesh around this recommendation. Kent? Oh, I saw a hand. Now
I'm
I
sorry.
don't see.
There we go.
Okay.
Missed the mic button. Was one of the partnerships, are they looking to partner anymore with CDOT on especially as you look around the areas at the boundary areas or something? I think that's one of the ones that they need to also look at, not just local agencies, but state agencies. And it might not be just CDOT, it might be the area agency on aging and some of those others. So
yeah, that's such a good point, Kent. And I probably was a little short-sighted in my description there, but yes, would be partnerships with other providers. It would be partnerships with the local agencies, nonprofits. It would be broader than what I described it as. So yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Kent, that's a good question and a point. A partner in this case is anybody who would like to come alongside RTD. It could be the private sector, the public sector, an NGO, a TMA, a TMO, anybody. The state, yes, definitely would fall into what we call a partner. The partnership with Mustang right now to have a common ticketing platform is something, Kent, that you're alluding to. So yes, definitely.
Well, I'm also thinking about along certain corridors, it might be that are partially in the district and partially outside the district. Maybe it's a partnership where one provides the service and the other one pays or reimburses or something like that. So it's one of those to be explored. But that's a good point. I'm glad to hear that you do include those when you say local.
Yes, good. Thank you. Okay, let's move into the next one. So one of the other aspects, and we have not talked about this much yet with the group, but one of the other pieces of our scope of work that's been kind of happening in the background is this boundary, RTD service boundary analysis. I have lots and lots of conversation about RTD's boundary. It's one of the biggest of when you look at RTD's peers. It's much, much larger than a lot of its peers. And so the conversation comes up, well, should it be this big or should it be smaller or should it be bigger? So there's a lot of conversation around that. And I'm gonna throw this information out here, and I want to be clear that this is preliminary analysis, and that I think there's a lot of different ways we could slice and dice the information and look at it. So if there's feedback or other information that we might be able to provide, I'd like to hear that. So we looked at this a couple of different ways, and we landed on looking at two different options. One is with RTD expanding to include East Aurora. And then we looked at one where, in the news recently, I don't know if we have anybody from Parker on the line right now, but in the news in the recent time, there's been a discussion about Parker potentially leaving RTD. So we said, well, what happens if RTD or if Parker leaves the RTD district? And it's really, there's such a broader conversation about benefits that transit provides in a community that are perhaps less tangible or financially, you can't put exact dollar amount on it, but we tried to put some dollars to both of those scenarios. And Matthew, if you're out there, would you just step us through the scenarios and sort of the process, and then we can open it up to some questions.
Yeah, and Holly, I'm just going to jump in really quick and then turn it back to Matthew. These are not proposals.
No.
What we did is we needed to come up with some hybrid way. Obviously, it would be mind-bending to look at expanding and contracting a huge district like ours comprehensively, but we tried to identify a couple places where you might be able to relate to it as TWG people and advisory committee. These are not definitely, no one's planning this. It's purely to illustrate what the business case and the economics might look like. So please don't read anything more into it than that.
Thank you so much, Brian, for making that clarification. Not a recommendation, not a proposal, just information to help us evaluate what happens when the district gets bigger and or smaller. So, Matthew?
Yes, so you see the bottom two bullets here. There are two basic components to this analysis. There's looking at what are the revenue implications for RTD, and then what are the operating cost implications. So for revenue analysis, we looked at sales tax and fare box revenue projections based on some data we had for per capita sales tax using population, and RTD has revenue by county data. And for operating costs, we kind of mostly focused on what would a new flex ride zone look like. And so for that, we used 3 existing zones that are kind of on the periphery of the district: Thornton, Brighton, and Parker, to get kind of an estimate of how much do these typically cost now. This is all based on 2019 data. And so you can see there, they generally cost about $34 per acre to serve. And the average annual ridership across these 3 flex ride zones was 220 per 1,000 residents. So that's kind of helped us. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is summarizing our analysis of East Aurora. So this is basically the large part of Aurora that's east of E470. There are some parts of that are actually already in the district, but a lot of it is not. And you can see that in these 2 maps. So the yellow part is kind of showing incorporated Aurora. And on the right, that light blue zones are the parts that are in RTD. So there's a large swath of it that is not. And so we looked at, this one we focused more on the future because there's a pretty small population in that area today. So in 2045, there's expected to be about 60,000 people living in this part of Aurora. So this is just the parts of Aurora that are not already in the district is the 60,000. And so EPS did kind of the revenue analysis part of this. They estimated that bringing that part of Aurora in would bring in $7.2 million annually in the 0.6 sales tax revenue. So this is just there's a 1% sales tax for RTD, but 0.6 of it is the operating costs, and the other 0.4% is the fast tracks, which doesn't really apply in this situation. So it's just that 0.6% would bring in 7.2 million. And it would also bring in, based on the revenue per county data for this area, it'd be $2.1 million in additional fare revenue. So you're getting close to about $10 million in revenue. And then you can see on the map on the right, the area traced in red, we kind of identified that as a potential future flex ride zone. And that doesn't cover the entire extent of East Aurora. It's just the parts that are expected to have at least 3 people plus jobs per acre by 2045. And so we calculated the area of that district and applied that $34 per acre. And so it'd be about $500,000 annually to operate a flex ride in that red boundary area. And then we also considered what would extending a fixed route service into that area cost. So the Route 10 which goes along 6th Avenue in this on the east side of the district. We looked at extending that, not so this doesn't get to the center of all of East Aurora, obviously, but that's the black line on that map. So it'd be kind of extending it about 5 miles, which would get it to basically the center of where there's already some development over there. And based on just the operating cost for the Route 10 already, it'd be probably about $2 million more in operating costs for that route if we extended it to that part of East Aurora. And then, so the Parker case study, this is kind of the opposite, looking at what happens if boundary contracts and Parker is no longer in the district. And so this one, we focused more on kind of the near term, since Parker is already largely developed. It's got a population of about 52,000 currently. And so this is also only applies to the 0.6 sales tax, because there's actually there's a separate obligation for the fast track sales tax that if Parker left the district, they would still be paying that sales tax for some time in the future. So if Parker leaves, the loss of that 0.6 sales tax revenue for those 50,000 people is the loss of about $6 million annually. And that would also result in a loss of about $500,000 annually in fare revenue. And then looking at the services that currently go to Parker, there is a flex ride that covers pretty much the entire Parker incorporated area. There's the Route P that goes from Parker to downtown. And there's the 483 that kind of goes east-west through Parker and Lone Tree, Highlands Ranch. And so taking out the flex ride and the Route P and then shortening the 483 so it doesn't extend into Parker would result in about $3.3 million annual in operating costs. And then, like Holly mentioned, there are several kind of, these monetary numbers don't account for every benefit and cost that would really be affected by this. Because some people from Parker, obviously, they would still be able to benefit from regional services like the R and the E light rail lines if they use the park and rides, but they would not. So currently, because Parker is in the district, people from Parker who park at a park and ride can pay the in-district parking rate. But if Parker was no longer in the district, they could no longer pay that parking rate. So they have to pay more if they went to like one of the Lone Tree stations to park.
All right, thank you, Matthew. So again, remembering neither proposed. Any questions, or did you generally follow the analysis? And I really think this is, at this point, it's an exercise of just understanding it, and perhaps a bit of guidance for us as we make recommendations for both the fiscally constrained and the needs-based plan. But I do think it's an interesting analysis, but not yet leading to anything that would be a recommendation. All right, I don't see any comments. So again, if as you take this away, oh, Kent, I see you up there.
Just a question. I noticed that you didn't put in the accessoride extension that you'd have to do a 3/4 mile either side. So that I know you're just comparing a couple of scenarios there, but
Yep.
you would want to probably put, because I think that's required, and I think there are
Yes.
3/4 miles either side of a route. So
Yep, that
you would
is
increase-
absolutely required. And I have to go back and look at the details of how we pulled the costs together, if we assumed that in each of those or not, but I'll check on that. It should absolutely be in there. Thank you for that, Ken.
Yeah.
Ron?
Yeah, I guess the East Aurora case study is interesting. I think if you're going to share this information beyond this technical group, I would think you would want to do a little bit more thoughtful exercise about what transit service you would actually provide to that area. Like the notion that 60,000 people are going to populate that area and you're basically just going to do a flex ride zone, when the area is going to, when your analysis shows the area is going to generate almost $9 million of annual revenue, and you're going to put $2.5 million worth of service out there to serve 60,000 people, it sort of raises a red flag about the how realistic that actually is. So,
you know, I think that's such a good point, Ron. I feel like, you know, as I'm hearing your comment, it feels to me like, and thinking about the presentation we had from your group at our last meeting where we talked about just how much land use drives our ability to capture ridership. I wonder if it's an opportunity to start dialogue with Aurora to say, how do we make sure that this is transit friendly and usable, and that we are all pointed in the same direction on what we're trying to achieve in our region, which actually I think is kind of one of the things where we've got a lot of different local agencies with their own unique needs and desires, and then RTD is this other agency, and CDOT, and so we've got a lot of goals and direction going on. It would be great to see us sort of come together and try to achieve that. So I really appreciate that comment. Thank you, Ron. Mac?
Yes, a couple things here on this hypothetical, although you will be receiving our.
Mac, you're super choppy. Can you maybe turn off your mic and turn back on, see if we can understand you?
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, it's still choppy. Go ahead. We'll decode.
A couple things. It's important to emphasize the major activity centers, employment sites, hospitals within this matrix of development, particularly east of the E470, and maybe be a bit more focused even in an example. So you have a rich service continuum identified in this example. In addition to that, the connections to the Aerotropolis area to the north, which is in the RTD district, but is starved. It's basically a desert now, and it's rapidly developing in terms of RTD service. So the interchange between an existing area that is not served by RTD and an existing area that's not in the RTD district at this point. So the interplay between those two. The other thing is the whole in terms of the voting, the annexation, there are different rules that apply in terms of securing votes to petition RTD to come into the district, and any actions that would take and modifications thereof. I think it will be important as well. So thank you.
Okay, Mac, I might not have gotten it all. I'm gonna circle back on that and quickly to make sure, and then maybe we can connect again offline, Mac, to make sure.
Yes, yes.
I'm getting it. So I'm hearing activity centers, making sure we understand the activity centers and the connectivity there. I'm hearing the connection between Aerotropolis and this being, being able to connect through there, one part being already in RTD and this being new. And then I think what I heard on the petition, like understanding the petition process to be in RTD, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. I'm gonna follow up with you, Mac, just to make sure I got all the nuances within that. But thank you for that comment. I think that's really helpful. Okay, transit agency of the future. We're short on time, and I want to make sure that we have at least a little opportunity to follow up on the scenario planning, because I think some of the initial findings that we found after we had an opportunity to talk with you and the advisory committee and the citizen advisory committee as well. We have some thoughts on that, and I would really like feedback. So I want to touch on this quickly. Sebastian is also out to help answer questions. He's been doing a lot of digging in on the workforce challenges. So this is another aspect that we've been working with RTD on. And as you know, this has been a big challenge for RTD recently, just having enough folks on hand to run the service that they want to operate. So within that, though, even prior to the pandemic, RTD was having they did a employee engagement survey and found that there's a pretty substantial number of staff that were identified as being unengaged, or in that unengaged category. And with that, what they were seeing, the fallout of attracting people and retaining people to stay at RTD was a real problem. In addition, some of those are as a result of systemic problems that they have. Some are right now, pandemic is just creating another round of issues for us to consider. So we want to dig into those. When we look to the future, there are also future needs that we know, and trends that are happening in our community and in our world that are going to change the skill sets that are needed within the workforce. So we're also starting to look at that. So these 7 boxes look at, just summarize each of the different things that we looked at as a team to start to think about the future trends and make sure that RTD is responsive to those. And then the next slide, and I think it's the next 2 slides, and this is really hard to read. So, but this really starts to outline some of from looking at our peer agencies, talking to RTD, looking at the problems that they have identified, looking at those future trends. What are some of the workforce recommendations that might come forward to respond to those issues that we've identified? And they are things from, career path, the work culture. Here up at the top, we've talked about public relations and centralizing CDL, the license process with other public agencies. Katie, if you want to go to the next one. Making sure we have adopt more diverse, multilingual, and far-reaching recruitment and retention programs and policies. So there's just a lot of stuff here. And this is based on, a whole host of people that we've talked to. We'd love to, if you all have great ideas that RTD should implement, please send those our way and we'll add them to the list as well. I've got screaming children. I'm at home today, so I apologize for the background noise. So I think, we've got a great and pretty comprehensive list here. But again, please send us ideas. If you have things within your agency that you have seen working, we want to add them. And this is a really important area to support RTD with as we move forward, if we want to get our great transit service on the ground. So any thoughts or questions on that? Okay, so let's dig in. You'll remember the last time we were together, we talked about 4 scenarios and we broke up into small groups and we gave a list of, I think it was 11 potential strategies that RTD may or may not use to respond to that particular scenario. And we asked you to identify and prioritize those few. So if we go to the next one, we can look at the 4 scenarios that we identified. So you'll remember we started with Hopeful Horizons, scenario 1, where we had funding in place, which we just like to say that seems to solve a lot of problems, funding in place, and telecommuting was high in this case. So people are more at home. We have less commuters coming into the office. That's scenario 1. When we go over to scenario 2, we have low workforce and telecommuting is high. So we have people, not only are they not coming to work, but we also don't have workforce available to serve that. Exploring efficiencies, telecommuting was low. So people are coming back into the office and moving around, but unfortunately workforce continues to be low. And then on the right side in scenario 4, we have funding available. Telecommuting is low, which means people are moving around again, back and forth to their job, which we identified as a favorable future for us. We want people, people are going to move around regardless, but commuting is one of those areas that we know how to capture that user a little more easily than we do if you're just making other random trips to, say, Target or down the street. So we took the information that you gave us from your small group report outs, and you identified identified some priorities and reported those out for us. So we summarized those. The blue dots we've flagged this as the strategy that's identified has a positive outcome under this scenario. Light blue it's a neutral outcome, and the red dot represents that the strategy could potentially have a negative outcome under this scenario. And then we've put some notes on the right-hand side. So Amy talked about this right at the beginning, but RTD acting as a regional mobility integrator, seamlessly coordinating with those third-party providers, providing those apps so that we have seamless trip planning and payment. Pretty much every group, the advisory committees, the technical working group, and the Citizens Advisory Committee all identified that this was a good idea, with the caveat that there was a couple of comments made that they felt that RTD should not be the one operating other modes, which we've heard from you before, but actively looking to partner and integrate with those other modes. The second one, which we also have heard on several occasions, is I think somebody in this group referred to it as put the R back in RTD. So this is really making use of RTD doing the thing that it does best, which is being regional, providing that backbone service. And this is what RTD is best suited, better suited than anyone else in our region to provide that kind of regional between our local agencies, high capacity, high demand service. Strategy 5 was partnering with local agencies, also identified, we've already talked about that as a real important piece of any scenario, any future scenario that could come to pass. And then increasing the diversity and funding sources, also very important and identified as something that could really help us overcome some of the hurdles. So the next 3, these were sort of what I referred to here as conditional scenarios, providing flexible on-demand service, implementing autonomous fleets, and adding high-capacity corridors through BRT investments. So some of these are great opportunities if you have funding to put them in place. Some become more challenging if we don't have that funding. So when we talked about the on-demand service, we talked about RTD should partner with other providers for those lower capacity on-demand services and explore how those on-demand technologies could support higher capacity services as well. And that's some of what we heard from Amy. When we talked, there was nobody was wildly averse to autonomous fleets, but realized that right now, this is not something that RTD can immediately go take action on. So we made some, in the notes here, we just made some notes that maybe what RTD does is start with some of the pilot projects that they're looking at, and then look to, maybe you're not looking for a full adoption until the industry as a whole gets to more of a level 4 automation. And then BRT advancements, I think this is a great opportunity. Again, you're going to need funding to put this in place. So I think everybody liked the idea. The challenge is really the funding. When we have funding in places, those become great opportunities. Now, these last set of strategies had more red dots in them. And this is where you have to sort of monitor the future, see where the future goes, and make good and resilient decisions for RTD on how you make investments, because we don't know what the future holds. And so what our goal is to provide recommendations that allow RTD to be nimble and resilient and responsive to a future that we don't have all the answers, right? We can be hopeful about what the future holds, but unfortunately, we're not today going to be able to say everybody's coming back to work and everybody's going to be commuting back and forth and we're going to be able to capture them. We can put things in place to capture them, but we don't actually know that they're coming back to that same travel pattern. So what do we do to respond to that? So ones that came when we did not have money in place, the scenarios where money was not in place or staff was not in place, providing that low capacity, short local trips was less favorable. The groups identified that as less favorable. Early adoption of a zero emission fleet, also less favorable when RTD did not have money. Now, one thing I'd like to hear from this group is we just had a discussion about the zero emission fleet with our WSP teaming partners. And in this time where money is tight, we're going to have to make some recommendations about how to move forward with that. And for every dollar that we take and put into a more costly electrified fleet is a dollar of operating that we're taking away from providing service. So this is where we get to those trade-offs, right? And these are really challenging trade-offs because I know we all want to provide service and we all want to move to that electrified or zero emission fleet. So anyway, I want you to, we don't need to answer that today, but I want to put that in your hopper. Complete the unfinished fast tracks corridor. When people are not coming back to work and we don't have money, this becomes more challenging, right? So what we wrote over here in the right is the fast tracks network is focused on serving commuters and needs to be explored as funding and demand for commuters returns. Based on the conversation we had today, I also feel like there's an opportunity to just talk here about what are the other modes and other things we should be thinking of, you know, when much like we've had the conversation about the 119 BRT to supplement that service. So I think there's, you know, let's talk about that. And then the last one that we had flagged in this set of that we gave you was shrink the district boundary or expand the district boundary. All of these ended up with some red mark on them where they were a good idea in some cases. And, you know, we love the idea of bringing in more funding, but if we don't have enough funding to provide good service, that seems unfair, much to Ron's point. You know, if you add 60,000 people and you tell them you're giving them one flex ride, is that really sufficient? Well, probably not, right? So, you know, need to have some more conversation around that. So I don't think there's anything to necessarily answer here, but these will start to guide prioritization. They will start to guide the fiscally constrained and the needs-based plan and the projects that go into those. So I just, you know, there's nothing magic to the exacting words here, but I love feedback. You don't have to give it to me now, but put it in your hopper and send feedback my way, if you would, please. Any questions or thoughts on these? Nothing. Okay, well, send it to me. I feel like, you know, it's a lot of information, as every meeting is, to absorb. So send me stuff as you're falling asleep tonight and you think, oh, that's nuts, Holly. Send me information and feedback. I think next up is our last slides with some public engagement.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Holly. If you want to go to the next slide. Just a quick sneak peek of what we've been up to in 2021. We have had a total of about 59 meetings. It's been group meetings, smaller meetings, board meetings. We've been, you know, lots of meetings. A lot of you guys have helped and participated in those. We really appreciate it. Just finished up 15 telephone town halls, and really one of our major focus over the last 3 or 4 months, and a lot of you guys participated in these, which we appreciate. We had 18 individual meetings with community advocacy groups and TMOs and TMAs and LCCs, Colorado Center for the Blind. So it was just a lot of groups representing different factions of the district and the different customers of RTD. And the importance of those meetings is we gathered, and we did this with you, gosh, I think it was 2 or 3 months ago, where we brainstorm strategies and we tied them to our guiding principles. And so throughout all these meetings, we have almost 300 different ideas from different groups about things RTD should be thinking about. And all of that has been incorporated into the information that you've just seen. So that's been a really important piece as we've been really thinking forward thinking on the mobility plan for the future. Switching to next year, we are very excited. A lot of our focus early next year is going to be on the systems optimization plan. In January, you're going to see a new tool online, and it is going to be similar to the information you're going to see in the upcoming meetings in December for the service sectors. But the idea is we're making it in a tool where you can look at maps and you can click on and off and really determine where the routes are, what are the recommendations for the different routes, and actually be able to provide your feedback. So we'll be sharing this with you, but we'll also be sharing it with the broader public, you know, through our different, we'll be advertising it through social media, press releases, and things like that. So when we get to that point, we would love your help in getting the word out about it, because this is going to be one of the main tools that we're going to use to really obtain feedback on that 2027 SOP. And then, as Holly mentioned earlier, then we're going to get into, so that January and February timeframe is when we're doing a lot of outreach around the SOP. And just to make sure you're clear, just to reiterate that, you know, we've got 2 things going on early next year. We've got the 2027 SOP. So that's when what we feel like we can provide service-wise based on financials and workforce by 2027. And that happens concurrently with the initial phasing of that, which will be that first run board in 2022. So the goal is, and what we've been working on for the systems optimization plan, is that longer term look for 2027, but they'll obviously have to be phased in through run boards over the next couple of years. So let us know if you have questions on that. We did want to make sure that that was clear. Next slide, please. A couple other things coming up. The big thing is you're going to be seeing these meetings probably Monday. Our hope is to send out the meeting appointments for the 2nd week of December by service sector, route by route. We're going to roll up our sleeves and really get into the details on that. So as Holly mentioned, you know, please feel free. You are going to get the invitation. You are invited to any of the service sectors you want, and please help us figure out who else you would like to have join there. As to Holly's point, Our concern is, we are more than welcome to have anybody at these meetings. Our concern is we don't want to miss anybody. And so we can really, really use your help in making sure you're identifying who really needs to be in that route by route discussion. The other thing we talked about is the Rebuilding Service Working Group. In December, we're breaking it up to 5 meetings, and then we're going to determine if there's value in bringing everybody back together. But given the level of detail we're getting out at the route by route level, it really makes sense to kind of break it out into geographic chunks so we can have a little bit more meaningful conversation. And other than that, we've got our advisory committee meeting. We did postpone that till next week. We didn't want to overlap with Veterans Day, but we'll get some additional feedback from that. So with that, I guess we can open up to any final questions. Holly, anything else?
Nothing else on my end. Any questions or follow-up from anybody?
One from Jean, it looks like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, for that information. Just a question about timing. So the route by route SOP plan will be presented to the board in mid-November, early December, and then to the various groups by sector in mid-December. Will you make the information that's being distributed to the board available to this group so we can review it at the same time they're getting that information?
Katie, can you go all the way back up to the actual, the table? I think there's a red table that will help guide us. And then I might ask Bill to, sorry, it's like way at the beginning. Uh-oh.
I'm just unsharing to get back there for you.
Oh, okay.
Quick.
Try
And then
not to.
I'll come
make
back
us-
and make not all of you sick.
Make us car sick. Thank you.
But the information we're sharing is going to be the same, correct, Holly? What's being shared with the board and what's being shared in the December meetings?
So the board, there are meetings that are about to be initiated with the board, small group meetings with them that will happen in the next few weeks to review the SOP recommendations. That is the second board member meetings on route level changes to the 2027 SOP, November, early December. Right after those meetings are the meetings we plan at the service sector. That's the same information there where we'll take you through route by route to say this is what we just don't want to catch the board off guard is all that's happening there. And then input on the 2027 SOP and route changes from the public. Now, this is more of the RTD service process that they go through will occur in early January after we've received input from you all and from the board. And then it will go to the board with the piece of that will happen in May 2022, and which is what I would call the first phase of the 2027 SOP goes to the board for the January Operations Committee. Did that answer your question, Jean?
Well, it did. It was consistent with what I thought. I guess my question is, will we have the information, the route by route information available to review at the same time the board is getting it?
You know, Jean,
No.
let me take a crack at that. I think the nomenclature is a bit confusing now that I look at it. It says board member meetings. What those are a couple of staff meeting with 2 board members at a time over a period of days. So it's not a board meeting. And the purpose of those meetings, Jean, is to acquaint the board with what we're planning to present on a larger basis so that they're familiar in advance. So one of the things we'll do is we'll work with the board, and there could be some refinements or additional information that the board brings up that we want to share with everybody in a broader sense. And that'll give us an opportunity to do that before the service sector meetings with you in December. So yeah, don't look at that as a board meeting. They're meetings with board members.
But I think I'm now reading between the lines here, Jean. Will you have it at the same time? And no, the RTD staff intent is to review it with the board before it goes out to this larger group.
Gotcha. And that's really helpful, Brian. Thank you for clarifying that these are one-on-one meetings with
Yes.
board members as opposed to a board meeting with this.
Yes, that is
absolutely.
That is
Appreciate
quite
that.
misleading, yes. And really it is to make sure that we are not sending something out there that the board is like, that is not our direction and incorrect in some manner. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Jean.
Anybody else? George, I saw you sent us an article. I'll take a look at that. Thank you. All right, well, we are at 4:30. I appreciate everyone, everyone's time and your participation, and look forward to more questions and comments that we receive from you as you dig into some of this information.
Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
All right, thanks all. Bye-bye.
A lot of information to think about here. Appreciate it.
Yes, it is.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.